Okay, it's 10 after. Shh, quiet, quiet. Okay, thank you. So, first of all, you remember there's no Wednesday lecture. I'm sure you had no trouble remembering that important item. And so if I forget at the end of class, I want to wish you all a very, very happy Thanksgiving. So have a great break. I'm sorry I have burdened you with paper worry responsibilities. I'm sure your parents or whoever you visit at Thanksgiving will be outraged, but tell them you got a day off from class. So, all right. So last lecture, we talked about power elite and pluralist theories of power. And I want to make one concluding point about pluralist theory before we move on to Marxist and class and institutional theories today. And that is that, first of all, the critique of pluralist theory, I think I said, or pluralist arguments and evidence, is that pluralists look at the decisions that actually enter the public arena and get made, not at the decisions that never appear on the radar screen, not at the things that are so off the table that you can't even see where power has been exercised. And you could imagine looking at that if, for example, you traced over a long period of time, I don't know, how the basic elements of the discourse about economic regulation in America shifted over time. Maybe things like political terminology. So I think it's interesting that gay marriage has gone from being called gay marriage to being called marriage equality. And on the other side, it's very interesting that there has been an effort to call the estate tax, the inheritance tax, the death tax. So you can see that there are attempts by powerful groups to shape what the political discourse will be, how things will be thought about and discussed before things ever get to the stage of actually being voted on or decided. But I want to make another point about pluralist theory that will be important later when we talk about institutional approaches, which is that pluralist arguments partly deal with the fact, and it's a very important fact, that in the United States, power is legally very fragmented. So that every decision that gets made in the United States basically requires the cooperation of a huge number of different actors. So that it's not just that the pluralists observe that different groups are involved, different groups in their understanding have power when you make different decisions, but also that anything that's going to get done is going to require, for example, cooperation at the state, local, federal levels. But not only that, we have all these independent regulatory agencies. So if you look at something in local politics, like trying to get, I'll take an example that's near and dear to my own heart, trying to get the Giants stadium built. So there was, I don't know what it was, 15 or 20 years ago, some decision that the Giants could no longer play in windy, cold, miserable Candlestick Park, and they needed, if they were going to stay in the Bay Area, they needed a beautiful new stadium. And the owners, who actually I think there was a sale of the team to owners who thought they were doing their civic duty, not just trying to make money by buying the team, but anyway, a new group of owners bought the team, and part of the deal was that San Francisco would try to build a new stadium to keep the team. That required, I don't even know the details of it, but the land belonged to Caltrain, the actual train service that comes up from San Francisco. In order to build it, you had to mobilize huge amounts of private money, which I think they did largely, but the city and the state had to give the land. And then zoning boards, regulatory agencies, environmental agencies, the mayor's office, state politicians, huge numbers of people had to all get on the same page to get anything done. This is an institutional feature of American political life that does not exist in quite the same form in many, many other societies. So this will come up when we do institutional approaches. But it might be true that pluralist arguments are more true in some societies than others, depending on what the channels of access to the political system are for different groups. So just at the simple level, because we have, and you learned about this if you took American government in high school or civics, or if you're not a citizen but you took some course to become a citizen or something on American government, you know that we have divided powers. That is, we have legislative, executive, and judiciary. And I'm sure every time you hear that, your eyes glaze over and you're already deep into nap time. But it's actually extremely important in the sense that it means that any group that's trying to do something has multiple channels to work through. So if you're a civil rights group and you lose in the legislature, you can try working through the courts. If you lose in the courts, you can try working through the legislature. If you lose in the legislature and the courts, and this has been very important in the Obama administration, where there are lots of things he couldn't do, there are a fair number of things he can do just by executive order that nobody can stop him from doing, that are just the prerogative of the president. So for some purposes, like the decision on gays in the military, if he had had to pass that through Congress to get rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he probably couldn't have done it with a Republican Congress. I'm not sure, but he probably couldn't. But that was, so it means that the American institutional system is part of what shapes the degree to which pluralist theory is or isn't true. Okay, and we'll come back to that later. Now, I'm going to go on to the third theory, and again, this will fit both of your readings for this week. So you're reading the Alan Witt thing that goes over the same three theories of power, not in as sophisticated a way as I did, I think, but nonetheless, at least it gives you some reading to hang on to. And then the Block paper, which is a very, very sophisticated, subtle argument that is remarkably influential, so you should pay attention. Okay, and this looks very confusing, but the thing to pay attention to are A, B, C, and D. So Marxist theories of power are really important and really interesting. And what they really deal with, it's not so much that they deal with Marxist theory of class, it's that they focus attention not on who has a reputation for being powerful or even who participates in decisions. It focuses attention on outcomes. That is, in the end, who benefits? And it's in that sense that the Fred Block reading for this week, The Ruling Class Does Not Rule, that paper, he's saying it doesn't matter whether the capitalists meet behind closed doors, lobby legislators, organize to get what they want. It matters whether the system ends up producing what they want. And if it does, they win, and then you need to figure out why. And that's what Block sets as his goal, is to figure out why they win, even though, at least in the period he was writing, you didn't see them directly exercising power as often as you might have thought you would. Now again, I think in our own period, the picture is a little bit different. But, so I want to talk about how it is that you can actually do research in this I'll call it a paradigm, even though that's not quite right, but how this approach supports its arguments with research. And again, the basic theory is that power serves the capitalist class. So in the end, who benefits? Just look at who benefits, and if you see that it's the capitalist class, say the Marxists, then Marxist theory is true. And that means that the focus is on outcomes. Again, You're not paying attention to who made the decision so much as who benefits. And I put up here a couple of books that you could look at, but the third one by Joran Therborn called What Does the Ruling Class Do When It Rules? I put that up there because it's a very clever paper. It's an old paper, you don't have to read it. But he answers that question basically with 2 words. What does the ruling class do when it rules? It wins. And that, I just love that way of posing the question. So basically, he gets an A for his title. All right. Then what is the method you can use to do research on this? And what sociologists call this is comparative historical research. And what it means is you have to find a situation where you can look at the outcome and compare it to some way it could have been different, right? So if you want to know who won at the end of a political struggle, you always have to ask, compared to what? That is, if I say, oh, the last, let me pick an arbitrary time, the last month, the last year, the last 5 years, the last 10 years, the last 20 years, the last 100 years, well, capitalism hasn't been overthrown, so obviously the capitalists won. Would you be satisfied with that as an theory of power? Gosh, then I wouldn't have to go out and do any research at all. I could just sit in my study and smoke a pipe. I don't smoke a pipe, but still. And I would already have, I don't even need, I don't even need to pick up the morning paper to do that. I could live under a rock for 10 years and be totally fine. So when you try to argue that one group or another benefited, that the outcome of some power struggle, the visible part and the invisible part, was that one group versus another won, you've got to have some image of what the alternative could have been or would have been, or some critical turning point at which something went this way versus that way. And one way to think about that is to do cross-national comparisons, so you can look at the fact that, say, social regulation or the relative equality of the tax structure or benefits to families with children are much higher in other European countries than they are in the United States. That's one way to think about these problems. But some of the most interesting arguments are historical. And they look at critical turning points and try to understand why the outcomes were what they were. And so the first book up there, Gabriel Coco, The Triumph of Conservatism, it's an old book, and I really love it. And it is about the progressive era in American politics. Now, anybody know when the progressive era was? Right? So it's the era of the 1910s and 20s. And you might think you're not interested in the progressive era, but in fact, most of the structures you live with today, the regulatory structures like the FDA that's supposed to guarantee the safety of drugs and medicines, consumer protection agencies, the things that regulate your food so that in principle, and in fact to a remarkable degree, you don't get poisoned by the food you eat. There aren't pieces of rat feces in the hamburger you get. This is all because we have this elaborate regulatory state. And the basic outlines of that state were set during the progressive era. The fact that California has the initiative and referendum system, that in principle we have nonpartisan elections. The fact that Berkeley has a city manager, a paid professional, who's actually more powerful than the mayor, and that many, many cities in the United States have these professional good government type political systems. And what's really amazing is that most of the parks and libraries you see are a product of the progressive era. This was a period of huge social reform in which the basic sort of forces of these were, one of the really fascinating things is that a lot of the progressive era reforms were pushed by middle class and upper middle class women who did not have the vote. And they used their influence with their husbands, but also, very importantly, an elaborate system of women's clubs, and they did research, and they explored issues like unhealthy milk that was giving people terrible diseases, and unhealthy food that was, again, being sold to poor families, and unbridled capitalism that was creating various problems. And they pushed, as did other progressive era reforms, for a huge increase in government regulation. So if you think about American history in sort of the long view, the period after the Civil War, starting in about the 1870s, is a period of huge amounts of industrial development. And it's kind of capitalism run rampant. It's when these enormous magnates, they build the railroads, they found these huge steel industry, they create, you know, this enormously competitive capitalism that is largely not ethically governed. So that's when you get the, quote, robber barons. Anybody know that term? Okay, these are the capitalists who just have no limit on their greed, and they do things like try to create a monopoly in a certain thing, so somebody will buy up all the resources of some key industrial ingredient and then charge sky-high prices for it. Or they'll try to, Jay Gould is the famous one, I think, who tried to corner the market in gold or something like that. You get these just amazing kind of excessive, and they were squeezing workers and using child labor and driving wages into the ground and, you know, just creating disease, pollution, you name it. And the progressive era is the period in which the United States worked out a way to tame capitalism. They regulated it. They created things like the antitrust laws that forbid monopolies. These are incredibly important. You have no idea what life would be like if someone could get a monopoly over some critical thing the public needed. A monopoly in milk. And then they could quadruple the price. They could raise it 10 times. A monopoly in gasoline, something really critical. They could raise the price as much as they, so there's a huge system of regulation that moderated the brutal excesses of capitalism and that built this whole array of not only regulatory systems, but again, these progressive social institutions like libraries and parks and so on and so forth. So I don't know the exact history, but my bet is if you checked out where Tilden Park came from. I know if you checked out the Berkeley Public Library, because I can tell by its architecture that it's from the 20s. So this is how we got the kind of civic life we now have. And Gabriel Kolko writes a book about this called Not the Triumph of Progressivism, but the Triumph of Conservatism. So what does he mean by this? And it's a fascinating, and to my mind, very powerful argument. He argues and he shows that during this period, in the 1880s and the 1890s, the competitive pressures of unregulated capitalism were starting to be extremely painful and costly to capitalists themselves. And the key example of this is the railroads. So you had a bunch of different railroad magnates, Stanford among them, building railroads, all in competition with each other. But it turns out that, of course, your ability to get freight traffic or even passenger traffic, but it was freight traffic that really mattered. Remember, there was no federal highway system or anything then, so the way you got products to their markets was on trains. It's still largely true. I mean, trucks are good, but trains are better. And the way you got products to market was on trains. They were incredibly important in commerce. And your train was valuable only if it connected to more cities, right? So the fact that you could get things from Louisville to Cincinnati, Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio, for those of you who've never been outside California and never thought there was a world outside California, is not much good to you if you can't then get things from Cincinnati to Chicago and from Chicago to California. And so these competing railroads were building track, actually losing money at a huge rate because they were building competing lines, even when it didn't pay, because they couldn't lose out in the battle to be able to get their line to go everywhere. So it was a tremendous effort to sort of what we would now say to acquire market share, even at enormous losses. And in fact, they often used different gauge, different track sizes, different size wheels. They had different engineering on their trains. And so you had this incredibly destructive competitive race, destructive for capitalists themselves, because they were competing against each other and driving down prices and driving up costs at a huge rate. You had other problems for capitalists, which is if you had a batch of milk that poisoned a whole bunch of people because it was infected with, what does milk get? Not tuberculosis. Anybody remember? No. Anyway, if you have a bunch of milk that is infected and a few babies die, families all over the country read about this and they stop giving their babies milk, and suddenly your profits plummet. This actually is what's going on now in China, which is they have a very weak regulatory system, and so suddenly there's melamine in the milk and babies die all across the country, and parents. So Kolko's argument is that the creation of the regulatory state and the progressive era reforms in fact benefited capitalists. And that when Teddy Roosevelt basically was the politician, so it's about 1912 that the legislative side of this gets done. I mean, it's getting done over the whole period. But that those regulations turned out to benefit capitalists. And what really came out of that, and came out of the Interstate Commerce Commission, is one of the very important regulatory agencies. It's actually the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution that allowed, that was the issue that the Supreme Court was supposedly going to base their decision about the Affordable Care Act on, if you remember. You're in school, so you don't read a real newspaper. But if you read a real newspaper, which you can do on the web, that's what's been going on. So the idea that you could regulate interstate commerce allowed federal regulators to essentially impose on railroads a common track gauge so they could use each other's lines, and basically to divide up the country into spheres of influence. So the B&O Railroad was here, and the Santa Fe Railroad was there, and the such and what other railroad was there. And so these huge railroad magnates could then just focus on making their own lines profitable, and they could interconnect with other people's lines. So basically everybody could ship everywhere on the same freight lines. So when your train, if you were the B&O Railroad, got to Chicago, it could switch to the Santa Fe Railroad's tracks to get to California. And that was federally regulated. So the government, in essence, saved capitalists from themselves. Because the pressures of competitive capitalism always will lead one manufacturer to think she can make more on the milk she sells by adding just a little bit of this high protein powder that nobody will ever know, or a little supply. That's what happens in China. It's not even the big manufacturers. I think it's the small suppliers, each of whom has a tremendous incentive to cheat. And that is always true. That is always true. And in fact, if you don't cheat, somebody else will be outpricing you, right? I mean, it's not that you want to cheat. It's that you eventually have to cheat. And the only answer to that self-destruct, this is part of what Marx said. He said capitalism is ultimately self-destructive. And Kolko says, darn right it is. capitalism is ultimately self-destructive, and the role of the regulatory state is to control capitalists' worst excesses so that it can be both productive and profitable. And the public may benefit from the productive side, and the capitalists benefit from the profitable side. And in fact, that you're definitely too young. This is not a matter of criticizing you for not having read the newspaper. But when I was a young woman, even into my 30s, I'd say, when you went to buy airplane tickets, they were all the identical, exact same price for the same route. Did you know that? And that was true, I think, from the 30s or whatever, all the way until the 70s and 80s. Probably was broken up during the Reagan administration in the 80s. And there were about 25 airlines. There were tons, ones you don't even, Braniff, anybody ever heard of Braniff? It was a big airline, and TWA, and there were a zillion of them. Why? Because the Federal Aviation Administration regulated airlines, and one of the things it did was prevent price competition. So you could compete in the quality of your planes, in how colorful the flight attendants' uniforms were. Braniff had these amazing kind of psychedelically colorful, very, very cute. Look it up, B-R-A-N-I-F-F. Not now, but if you're on, if you're on the web sometime. Look, it's a genuinely fascinating era. And so the effect of government regulation was to create a protected floor for airline prices, and they couldn't charge less than that amount, which meant that the airlines, yes, they were supposed to have safe planes, and we still have a lot of regulation. So you can't run your low-budget airline so low budget that you basically say to people, look, we don't have mechanics. But and so at some point, our planes are going to fall out of the sky, but you can go to New York for $50. Now, some of you would take, if their safety record was still okay, some of you would take that deal, right? But they can't offer that deal. So you could think about that, that limits competition. So we still have a regulatory state, even though we now allow price competition, and the effect of that is that now there are only about, well, I was just trying to go to New York, and now that Continental and United have merged, there are relatively few airlines. 4 or 5, I don't know, American, Delta, I can't count, but, and there are occasional new ones start up, so, Virgin America, although I just heard on the radio that might be about to tank. So, and right now there's price competition and it hasn't hurt safety and seems to be working pretty well, but you can see that the regulatory state was hugely protective for capitalism. It was protective for the railroads. It was hugely protective for the steel industry. This was another place where it wasn't illegal to collude. So steel magnates could get together and say, we're going to keep prices up. We're not going to sell our steel for less than a certain amount. And they would agree to that. And then somebody would offer a secret discount, and you would have a price war. And the price of steel would get driven down to below the cost of production. It really hurt profits. And so this regulatory state produced a regulatory system for steel in which you couldn't add the cost of transporting the steel to the price of the steel. So if you were ordering steel for a new building or something in Texas, it would cost you the same amount whether you ordered it from Pittsburgh or from Atlanta or from anywhere. And that was, again, government regulation. So Kolko's argument is that at this critical turning point, you can see how federal power was used. You can see what actually happened. There was an alternative, which was this unregulated capitalism, and the political outcome, while it had many benefits for consumers, and the one huge benefit, they broke up. So the one capitalist who got hurt was Rockefeller. So the original Rockefeller fortune was based on Standard Oil and all those red, white, and blue gasolines. Chevron, and I don't know if they still exist, but there used to be Esso and a zillion different red, white, and blue gasolines. That was the leftover from the breakup of Standard Oil. Apparently, Teddy Roosevelt hated Rockefeller, and that was the one thing he did that actually hurt a capitalist. He made Rockefeller sell off his monopoly on gasoline. But otherwise, the argument of Kolko is that this form of power ended up benefiting, not hurting the capitalist class. And there's a related set of arguments that I'm more ambivalent about, but I want to talk about, and the original source of them is Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward's book, Regulating the Poor. This was an argument that the welfare system, which again looks like a hugely progressive achievement for the poor and their advocates, in essence serves capitalism. And so they made the argument that, and this was when we had welfare, so we now have TANF, which is a very different system. But in the period up to the Clinton administration, from basically the New Deal to the Clinton administration, there was a system of welfare that was aid to families with dependent children and a set of related programs that are for people with disabilities and so forth. But the argument was that this is what maintains the reserve army of the unemployed, Marx's term, so that capitalists always have extra workers available. That is, who's going to keep those people alive? So that when business goes through cycles, you lay off workers, you take workers back. You lay off workers, you take workers back. So all the systems like unemployment insurance, right? Who pays to keep those workers available? I mean, you could imagine a system in which all the workers who weren't currently needed starved to death. Get thrown out of work, there's nowhere for you to go, or even if not starved to death, became so impoverished, demoralized, malnourished, their children so malnourished, that when capitalists wanted to start up their business again, there was nobody who could do the work. Some people were out scrabbling around in some field somewhere trying to grow a few plants to support themselves or keeping chickens in their backyard, but they were no longer able to be industrial workers or to work in a shop or to put on nice clothes in order to sell insurance or whatever. And the argument that Piven and Cloward and others have made is that everything from the welfare system to unemployment insurance to many, many other forms of public support is basically a subsidy to capital that keeps workers available and indeed keeps available a pool of workers who keep average wages down. That was Marx's idea about the reserve army of the unemployed, that they're the ones who will take your job if you demand too much in wages. And the Marxist argument is that the whole welfare system works this way. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about the critique. And I hope that next week's readings, which are tremendously interesting, they're about how the Affordable Care Act got passed. And so it's contemporary, it's vivid, it's actually, the longest reading is by one of the people who actually was a sort of fighter in the trenches who helped get this done. And he tells a kind of insider account. But the critique of these Marxist approaches, the first one is what I'm calling non-falsifiability. And what I mean there is that if your argument is that in the end capitalism always survives, the argument I started with, then basically nothing except a total revolution could show that your theory was wrong. And we kind of agreed that that would be kind of a dumb, I mean, again, if in the last year, the last 5 years, the last 10 years, the last 100 years, capitalism hasn't been overthrown, well, again, okay, I'm done. Let's go to lunch. But don't these other arguments have a similar problem? So let's imagine that Obama had lost on the Affordable Care Act, or it had gotten thrown out by the Supreme Court. if you were a Marxist, maybe even if you were a pluralist or power elite theorist, you would say, the capitalists won. And we know that mostly the business elite opposed the Affordable Care Act and National Association of Manufacturers, and you'll see when you read it. So you would really make the argument, the capitalist class won. Well, if it passes, actually, there's a very good argument to be made that the major beneficiaries will be American capitalism. Both the insurance companies, which are going to make out like bandits when everybody is mandated to have insurance, but also employers, who now will have a stable source of health care for their workers, subsidized by taxes. In fact, one of the mysteries of American political debate in the last 50 years that I truly don't understand, and I've never heard a good argument about this, is that one of the things that would help American industry and American business the most is to have publicly funded health care. Why don't they want single payer, in which taxpayers subsidize the business expenses of all the large corporations that spend a fortune on health care? And if we had single payer, publicly provided health care, and I'm not claiming it would be better than what elite people like myself get now. I'm not going to claim it. I hope it would be, but I don't know that. But we know from cross-national comparisons that it would cost close to half as much, and it would mean that businesses were not saddled with this huge, constantly growing, unpredictable expense. Why don't they want it? Why haven't they fought for it? Why haven't they been out in front? And you could, maybe it's just they don't want government to get bigger, because if government gets bigger and shows it can do something successfully, it'll come regulate them more. I actually don't understand it. But in terms of competition of US corporations with foreign corporations, one of the major problems for the American auto industry, but for many, many other American businesses, is that they compete internationally with countries that have workers who have guaranteed and much less expensive health benefits. So if the Affordable Care Act wins and you're a Marxist theorist, you say, see, a triumph for capitalism again. And so the theory can easily be non-falsifiable in the sense that you can make a pretty good argument that whichever way it comes out, American capitalism has won. And that is, so I actually believe Kolko's argument. That is, I believe that many of the progressive era reforms were enacted into law and became part of the American regulatory state, or the regulatory state was invented to solve problems capitalists couldn't solve for themselves. But I think the problem for it as a kind of empirically based sociological argument is the problem of knowing what outcome would you be satisfied with that would show you that your theory was wrong. Your theory may not be wrong, ever, because capitalist interests are very powerful in a society like our own, and they typically don't lose. They typically gain a little, lose a little, gain a little, lose a little. They don't lose big time. But that problem is a huge problem analytically. And related to that is political fatalism. So this is actually an argument Fred Bloch made, but not in the paper you're reading, which is if you really buy this Marxist class theory in its pure form, then the fact that huge numbers of civic actors fought to get these reforms passed, these women's clubs fought against industry to get safe milk, to get child labor laws that forbade child labor, to get protections for pregnant women, to get safe food, to get safe drugs, to get, you name it, all sorts of public benefit, to get parks, to get libraries, to get better schools. All these things, are you just going to say, well, all better schools do is give capitalists more educated workers? It socializes, which it does, the cost of preparing a labor force that can actually work in a modern industrial economy. That is what schools, that's one of the many things schools do. And that, you know, in my view, they ought to do. But if you really believe that the capitalists always win and that any outcome you get just shows how powerful they really are, kind of like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Has everybody seen that? Ooh. Okay, there are a few versions of it. It's great. It's a great movie and it's great sociologically. But Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you basically you turn to the police officer to save you, and then you see, oops, he has this telltale thing sticking out of the back of his neck that shows he's been invaded by the body snatchers, and he's now one of them. Ooh. So this is sort of Invasion of the Body Snatchers theory, which is no matter what outcome you get, there was no point in political struggle. There was no point in efforts to shape the society because the capitalists always win. Okay, so this is both one of the most powerful theories we have. I think without paying attention to outcomes, much of political sociology doesn't really work. But on the other hand, you have to really think hard about what kind of evidence you're persuaded by and what you're not, and about the kinds of political struggles in which maybe the capitalists don't lose, but they don't win what they really want. Okay, now I'm going to move to the theory that I am most fascinated by, and you won't be surprised by this, which is institutional theory. And I'll go back. I just want to get you to not check out mentally when you see the word institution. And I've tried to get you from the beginning of the course to think this is important and it matters. And it matters all the time. So I think in that very first class, you were willing to say, yes, the institution of the family is incredibly important in the way I structure my life. The institution of the corporation, as it exists in America, is incredibly important in the way you see yourself. The institution of the labor market, let's say. In societies that don't have an institutionalized labor market, people don't sit around saying, gosh, I have to get that BA, even if it's miserable and I'm suffering, because without that BA, I can't get a job. And instead, I mean, I know this from my work in Africa. If you live in a society that doesn't really have effective labor market institutions, you think of yourself in terms of the people who can protect you, the people who can help you, the people who might, for some arbitrary reason, want to hurt you, the people who are from your ethnic group and might protect you, the people who are from some other ethnic group and might try to block whatever it is you're trying to do, the people who are your friends who can guarantee that some piece of land will be your land. And without the institutions of a labor market, you don't think of yourself as a person with certain skills, certain will to work hard, certain ambition, how you were educated by your family for certain. So many of the things about us are shaped by the institutions we live and work in. Okay, now, what is an institutional theory of power? And I'm only going to get partway through this, and then that's what we'll discuss next week, and then the course is over. Okay, and I want to start with a really old-fashioned but very important point. So Talcott Parsons, who was a great sociologist of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, he was the dominant figure in American sociology by far. It was a weird period where basically one person, one short, squat little man with a little mustache and tobacco stains here and pot belly, he was about that tall. Intellectually, he dominated the entire field of American sociology for about 3 decades. He was the most influential figure by far. And he wrote essentially incomprehensible prose, except for his beautiful translation of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Weber, where he transcended himself. Okay, but he made a brilliant argument in a paper, I think in about 1962, called On the Concept of Political Power. And he made the point that, remember where I started with A's power over B? That if you always thought power was one person being able to make someone else do something that person would not otherwise have done, then power was always, quote, zero sum, meaning if A's power increased, by definition, B's power decreased. So the sum of all the changes in anybody's power would be zero. So it doesn't matter what unit, but you measure it on a scale of 0 to 100, and you start out, A has 60% of the power and B has 40%, and B fights against A and organizes and mobilizes, and at the end of the process, A has 55% of the power and B has 45%, right? If you think of power that way, the changes are always zero sum. But Parsons said another dimension of power besides the distributive dimension is the ability to get things done. And if you think of power that way, which is what is the capacity of any given actor to get things done, then power is not zero sum. And in fact, the most important examples of power are not zero sum at all. So let me go back to the ballpark, my favorite example, but there are many, many examples of this sort, which is if you have ineffective politicians and tremendous amount of conflict, and let's say a neighborhood group manages to block the creation of the ballpark, which it was actually built largely on, I think, or entirely on public land, but I assume there was still a lot of local opposition. If you're the person who has a little house there and you know that rents are going to go up by, so you don't have a house, you rent an apartment near the ballpark, and you know that rents are going to go up by a huge amount and you're going to be driven out of the neighborhood. So let's say your little community group organized and a few other groups and people who think sports are a bad investment, which they may be, and people who want to use the waterfront for other reasons, and they had managed to block it. And then, literally, nothing might have been done except to stop it. So what these institutional theorists of power look at is what are the features of political institutions that allow actors to get things done versus the features that stop groups from getting things done. And this raises huge comparative questions like, would you rather be the most powerful person? So if you think of power as having, here I need a piece of chalk and then I'll conclude the lecture. But if you think you want to have a lot of power, if you want to be the most powerful person in Haiti, during the Duvalier regime at least, maybe Doc Duvalier and Papa Doc and Baby Doc, they maybe had 80% of all the power in a system that was basically incompetent, riddled with corruption, riddled with violence, versus Barack Obama, or even better, maybe he's a prime minister of some somewhat more functional country. But Barack Obama might have 10% of the power and the scale isn't quite right here, but in a much more functional system that can mobilize, it's not just richer, or let's say it's richer because it's institutionally more functional. That would go back to Acemoglu and Robinson. But it also is politically more functional. It can actually get things done. It can organize vast numbers of people in cooperative or coercedly organized activity. And so you can ask of political institutions not just how they distribute power between A and B, but how they generate levels of the capacity to get things done. And institutional theorists focus on how much of that capacity there is and what allows political systems to have that capacity. So last point, it's 11 o'clock, you can go, but this is where it's very tough for Americans. I talked about this at the beginning with our sort of democratic populist instincts. We want systems that have less power, power to the people, let's fight the power holders. Institutional theories appreciate power as part of the collective capacity to get things done.